It started in 1777, 1 year after the partisan victory over the British on June 28, 1776, on Sullivan's Island, right at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The battle was fought, both a naval and land battle, fought by a combined British force that was the most powerful that had been assembled to date to try to crush the rebellion in the American colonies. The South Carolina forces met them on Sullivan's Island and stopped the land forces, as well as inflicted heavy damage on the Royal Navy, thus requiring them to withdraw. So 1 year later, on the first anniversary, they celebrated here in Charleston the first Carolina Day, and it has been more or less celebrated annually since that date. So please join me in welcoming Doug Bostick.
Sam, first let me thank you and the members of the Palmetto Guard for this kind invitation on a beautiful Carolina day here at the Battery. As I got out here a little bit early, I had the chance to chat with Colonel Steve Riggs, and he shared with me a story. He said that he was with a client this morning, and on greeting him, he said, "Happy Carolina Day." To which the gentleman responded, "Yeah, we won last night, didn't we?" So maybe a befitting precursor to Carolina Day, and perhaps we'll celebrate it this evening with another national championship. Also, as I was reflecting, sitting out here, I was reminded back to my days at the College of Charleston as a student, and I anxiously enrolled for a course, the history of the South. My professor, who the college had borrowed occasionally from the Citadel, he came into class the first day, and you just had that feeling that he was looking at us civilian rabble as people hardly worthy of his words and observations. And he pushed his glasses all the way down the end of his nose, and he said, "There are 3 things about me that you should know. And if you find them objectionable, I suggest you drop the class." Well, one of the 3 was when he offered the opinion that we never should have left England, God save the Queen. So that was my introduction to history of the South. Of course, this great day is the day that we honor the Charleston Patriots, who gave the incredible British fleet perhaps their greatest defeat in their history, and provided the 13 young colonies with the first significant military victory of the conflict with England. The first battle here, though, was not between Patriots and British, but it was between General Charles Lee of the Continental Army and President John the Dictator Rutledge, over who in fact had command of the Carolina militia. And as often happens in this modest city of Charleston, Rutledge won over the day. The great victory, guided by Colonel William Moultrie, has been chronicled by many others before me on this day. Moultrie, of course, became a hero to South Carolina and the nation, and many accolades were offered. On just several days later, July 1st, Fort Sullivan was renamed Fort Moultrie in his honor. On July 20th, the Continental Congress passed a resolution of congratulations and thanks. And perhaps maybe his most favorite accolade, a gentleman, William Logan, sent Moultrie a hogshead of old Antigua rum, thanking him for the great victory. The anniversary of the Battle of Fort Sullivan began, that observation, or observing the anniversary began the very next year in 1777. Through time, it's been known as Palmetto Day, Sergeant Jasper's Day, the anniversary of the Battle of Fort Moultrie, and almost 150 years ago, began being known as Carolina Day. Throughout the history of this city, we've marked this day with artillery salutes, militia demonstrations, parades, in the 1800s, celebrations on the public square of Moultrieville over on Sullivan's Island. And there was a grand tradition of the assembly of the Palmetto Guards in Fort Moultrie itself. Now I'm going to take you not to today and not to 1776, but to 1851. In 1851, tension was already high between southern states and the federal government. And after South Carolina had adopted a position that had been hotly debated even since 1820, on June 28, 1851, when all Charlestonians went to Fort Moultrie for the grand celebration, the United States Army refused to admit the Moultrie Guards and their fellow South Carolinians to the great fort. The predictable response was great indignation. The Charleston Mercury wrote, "If there be one spot within the limits of the state more hallowed by historic recollections in the minds of the people than any other, that spot is the battleground of Fort Moultrie." So the celebrations did proceed on Sullivan's Island, though not inside the fort. And at the end of the day, everyone came back to the city by boat and marched through the streets to the Great Charleston Hotel, where the newspaper reports 3 echoing cheers were given for South Carolina and the same number of heart-rendering groans for the federal government and the U.S. Army. That same evening, a group of young men met to form a company which might guard the Palmetto State. Thus, the Palmetto Guard was formed and attached to the 17th Regiment of South Carolina Militia. Palmetto Guard has an impressive history, as do most of our great militia units, many of whom are represented here today. They were involved in guarding the U.S. Arsenal in 1860-61. They manned a battery at Morris Island during the firing on Fort Sumter, and they were one of the 2 regiments to occupy Fort Sumter upon the evacuation of Major Anderson and the federal garrison. On June 28th of each year, through their history, the Palmetto Guards held their reunion and anniversary here on Carolina Day. At one such meeting, the idea for a monument to the great defenders at Fort Moultrie was born. Funds were raised through a grand fair at the Hibernian Hall, and the cornerstone of this monument here that we're surrounding was laid on Carolina Day in 1876, the 100th anniversary of the battle. The monument was unveiled on Carolina Day, 1877. The News and Courier reported that the Palmetto Guard chose the 28th of June for their anniversary, and it was appropriate they should erect a monument which should tell to future generations not only the proud story of Moultrie and his followers, but also how their descendants, a century later, honored their memories and cherished as a precious gift that liberty for which they shed their blood and risked their lives to obtain. After some number of decades of inactivity, the Palmetto Guard was reorganized on Carolina Day 2003. It's fitting, I think, as a writer and historian, that here on the Battery we're covered by 3 of our great monuments. The monument to the defenders at Fort Moultrie, the monument to General Moultrie himself, recently established, and the monument which was established in the 1930s to the defenders of Fort Sumter. Recently, we've had the late unpleasantness, and I'm not referring to the war, but referring to the sesquicentennial of the war. And the community has visibly struggled with what to do with that, how to commemorate it, how to honor it. And I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we honor it by honoring the service of all the great patriots of South Carolina. I had an experience some years ago, and some of you have heard me tell the story before. I was invited to ride in Veterans Day Parade with an Army colonel in riding in his Jeep. And as we drove through the streets of Charleston, whenever he saw a veteran that had any type of Vietnam insignia, a cap, a shirt, you know, the recognizable service ribbon for Vietnam veterans, whenever he saw that, he made one simple gesture that reduced men that were the recipient of his gesture to tears. He just simply looked at him and pointed and he said, "Welcome home, brother. Welcome home." And that's all that needed to be said. We all know that collectively as a nation, we did not honor those veterans on their return home. Somehow, in some way, our society decided to gather our disagreement over the war and lay it at the feet of the veterans, which was remarkably unfair. In a somewhat related story, I had the great pleasure and honor to chair the sesquicentennial celebration at Fort Johnson, marking the firing on Fort Sumter this past April. And as such, there were lots of media. And so on one occasion, I was in my office and the phone rang and I picked it up and it was a reporter from Boston. And we started talking about the commemoration and the plans for it. And I mentioned to him that the descendants of the man that pulled the lanyard on the first gun were going to be in attendance. And so he asked me a fascinating question, though maybe not entirely unexpected. He said, "Do you think they're embarrassed by their ancestor?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And it made me reflect back to that gesture to the Vietnam soldiers. And I told him that it is not the job of a soldier to settle the political questions of the day. It's the job of a soldier to settle the military ones. The men who were at Fort Sullivan in 1776 faced the greatest fleet in the world. The men who were amongst the 300 in the small garrison at Fort Sumter faced an awesome combined firepower of Federal Army and Navy. Our duty as citizens, as grateful citizens, is to recognize and thank them for their service and honor them by remembering their service to the state of South Carolina. I know you all join me in a fierce pride to be an American. And I know you also join me in a fierce pride to be a South Carolinian. My wish for all of us is that we learn from those before us the spirit of their convictions. My wish for all of us is that we all learn to stand on our convictions. My wish for all of us is that we all teach our children to do the same, that we all teach them to be a patriot. On Carolina Day, God bless all the great patriots of South Carolina, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.